Hello. Right. Is this thing on? Have a look. There'll be a lot of is this thing on tonight? Because it's my first time, probably. Let's see what's going on. Okay. Hopefully you can hear it. Hopefully you can see it. Hopefully the fan back will die down so there's less noise. And I'm also hoping that I can, oh yeah, okay, I can see what people are saying without having to run Chrome, which is great, because I need to strip this to the bone so that OBS will run happily on the Mac. Right, let's see. Okay, well, I wrote myself some notes to guide me through what is going to be a pretty wide-ranging first time. It says boot the Amiga. Well, I've done that. You can see the Amiga is booted. It says quick spiel, which I'm doing now. It says play a doskpop tune, a chiptune, a drum and bass tune, and another tune, because you should have music to listen to and things to look at straight away. Then a word about hardware and software limitations, about what the Amiga is and why it is a thing of its own and a very distinct thing. What a tracker is, but what Protracker is in particular. You probably know what a tracker is if you're here, or if you're not, you'll find out. And I'll touch as briefly as I can on why Protracker is so important to me and so many other people. An overview of the interface, some of its quirks and interesting things, and things that just don't make any intuitive sense and you just have to learn them, things that are really nice and you wish you'd see in software now that you don't. And then we'll try and make a tune. If we've got time this evening, we'll try to actually make a tune, walk you through the process. You might want to give it a try yourself. And then my last note says interspersed with digressions. Well, I can't help that. That's how I do. But I'll try to keep those digressions short and to the point. Yeah, so let's have a tune first. This is a doskpoppy kind of style tune of mine. Doskpop is kind of hard to nail down, but it's basically late 80s synth pop. It will feel to people of a certain age, maybe who had Amigas, like a lot of demo music and video game music was back then at the turn of the decade. It uses lots of samples that you would hear in the 80s on other things, on fancy synths like Fairlights, orchestral hits and stuff like that. New Jack City, Kate Bush songs, all the people who were starting to use sampling. It was only a few years after that that the Amiga came along and gave everybody sampling, pretty cheap sampling with reasonable quality. So we'll have a doskpop tune, then we'll have a chiptune, and then we'll have a drum and bass tune. So yeah, this is one of mine called Olden Days, appropriately, because this is all about nostalgia and me feeling old. So yeah. Italo for nerds, yes. Yes, it is. How are the levels? Are the levels okay? I'll talk about levels in a bit. Tell me if it's clipping too much. I know you will. cue. Is that better? Yeah, there's buffer junk happening as well. I got to probably hit a loop point, so I'll stop that. So yeah, huge big caveat for all of this. I said in my intro video, which you can subject yourself to if you want, which is half an hour of me rambling, I pointed out that in my day job I am a film sound recordist, an audio post engineer, and I do music and audio for video games. Most of my day job involves getting samples recorded and processed as cleanly as possible with as little noise, removing noise surgically, getting rid of noise, shaping it, doing all this. Tonight what we have is one of the noisiest setups you're likely to hear. It's absolutely appalling in here. The Amiga noise floor, especially the 600, is huge. If I kill it, you'll hear it disappear somewhat. The max fans are kicking up. There's lots of stuff interfering, causing buffer underruns and all sorts of things. But it's kind of in the spirit of things because one big topic I'll be covering is compromise, the nature of compromise, the subjective nature of quality, and how that all factors into a medium which is 8-bit. I mean, whatever you hear tonight coming from this Amiga is 8-bit audio, even if it sounds, if you come to associate 8-bit with chip samples or square waves, you will hear a lot of audio that's just been smashed down to 8-bit, usually 11025 hertz or thereabouts, and stuff that you wouldn't tolerate in an MP3 in 2005, you know. But I also talked about this in the video. You talk to somebody who loves vintage MPCs and they'll talk about the 12-bit sampling rates and bit depth on there and how they love that sound, that crunch. That's how I feel about the Amiga. A lot of people do as well. And if you can't deal with that, then you're not going to have much fun. But there we go. So that was a doskpop tune. So you'll have heard a lot of those samples were what you would think of as real audio rather than chip samples. I'll turn that up a wee bit. Some of them are gnarly, you know, because hey, definitely got some. Oh god, this gain knob is like being a safe cracker. So yeah, that's been synthesized somewhere in its history, possibly by me actually. I don't think I stole these samples. Is the keyboard nice and tappy, by the way? Yeah, that's a real mechanical keyboard right there. Hey, there's an orchestral hit. If you play it, if you hide it in the mix, it doesn't sound quite so grim as it sounds by itself. But yeah, some lovely dithering and distortion going on there. Pulse width mod synth going on there. So yeah, that's the kind of sound you'd be hearing a lot in the demo scene and in the Kraken scene and on your WESD games in between about 88 and 95. alongside chiptunes, which existed at the time to serve a nostalgic purpose of reminding people of Commodore 64 tunes, VIC-20 tunes, and also because they needed to be tiny to fit at the start of a cracked game disc. You had like 20 kilobytes to play with. You filled it with some graphics and maybe a trainer and a tiny bit of music. Talk about that in due course. Had a chip tune I was going to fling on here. Yeah, here's a chip tune. So, some more samples than I remember having. So these are chip samples. They are samples. There's not a synth chip in the Amiga. The idea when chip tunes were first being described as that, when the term was coined by people like Turtle and Does in the demo scene, and I think Format as well. I'm not sure if he believes that he thought of it, but he was one of the first people to be using it to describe a very small file size of tune, which uses looping samples that are only about 1632 bytes long. And I'll show you how to make those in a text editor, or another way of getting them is to just load a binary file into Protracker as if it's a sample, and then just trim it right down and see what you get. Fun. It's a little hat. So lots of the kind of principles you would see in LSDJ, Game Boy. In fact, LSDJ was quite heavily influenced by Protracker and AHX, which is another Amiga tracker, in the design. It's doing different things with a different chip, but some people straddle the distinction between the two very nicely. My friend Saberpulse has always had slightly Amiga sort of feel to his Game Boy music, which I've always loved. We'll talk about that. Now I'll shut up and play a chiptune. I think it's a funky chiptune. Chiptune there, sort of doing what chiptunes do, but a little bit funky. And then There are whole other areas of using Protracker to make music and using trackers generally, but one thing I love to do when I sit down at Protracker, and a few other people are still doing it all these years later, is to make jungle and drum and bass, and other things. Let me see. I copied some of these over earlier and they corrupted horribly, but I think it will work now. So those chiptunes would normally be between 5 and 20 kilobytes in size. They're designed to be as small as possible. The RAM you have available to you is half a meg in a 500, an Amiga 500, unless you've expanded it. You can get a meg out of that. I think you can get 2 megs out of a 500 plus. This Amiga 600 has 1 megabyte by default, and I've added another one over the years. And no matter how much you can pack an A1200 with lots and lots of RAM, 16, 32, 128 megabytes of RAM, but Protracker will never see any of it. Protracker only sees 2 megabytes max. So that's the kind of space you've got to work with, and you've got to think, well, if I want to copy a sample into the buffer and to another location or do some cutting and pasting, that's all limited by the RAM you have available, and the computer's using that RAM as well. Fortunately, the Amiga has custom graphics chips. It was one of the first computers to have a set of custom chips to handle graphics and sound. So it gives you most of that memory to play with, but it's still not much. And then way back in the day, you were limited by the media size. So an 880 kilobyte floppy disk was all you had to stick a single tune on. Tunes rarely got up that high. And if you wanted to share it on a BBS, then smaller the better for that. There's a sort of drum and bass one, I think. It's a while since I did this one. Yeah.
Just like sun, then like moon.
I do also use Fast Tracker 2 and Milky Tracker and AHX. Not so much Renoise these days, but I've used that a lot. And there are a few other trackers as well. I'll cover them if people are interested as well. I'd like to do AHX because that's cool. Hively would be nice. I no longer have an Amiga capable of running it, and there is a PC port and a Mac port, I believe. I know the replayer was ported to almost every system imaginable, including some that I think don't have screens or some that weren't ever made. But it's an absolute monster. I used to have an Amiga that would run it. That Amiga is the one that has a fan built into it and used to sit on raised feet for airflow because the processor was running so hot. The extra PPC that was bolted onto it was running so hot. Cheers, Hoffman. I will send it to you. I don't think I released that. I just did it and got distracted. So another thing, I'm sorry if you can't hear me talking over the music. I did respond to MPJV and said yes, I do use Fast Tracker 2 and some other trackers, and I'll talk about those sometime. Hively, I did loads of tunes in Hively Tracker, which is an evolution of AHX Tracker, and I'll find a way to hopefully play those and talk about them. I'm not a fundamentalist about keeping this purely Pro Tracker. In fact, that should be the theme of this whole thing. I don't want to be gatekeepery. I don't want to be protectionist or defensive about Pro Tracker. The only reason I'm not covering Octamed, for example, Pro Tracker's great rival, is that I don't know what I'm doing in it. I'm terrible at it. There are people who are great at it, and you should go and ask them to do streams or to give you tips or whatever. It's fantastic. It does awesome stuff. It handles MIDI really well. Pro Tracker does not. I will show you the MIDI config in the setup. There it is, MIDI off, on, off. It takes up a little bit of memory. You can see the free memory available changes, but it does nothing. And in the source code, the assembly source, it's just a dead end hanging there. Nobody ever did anything with that. There might be some custom versions that demo groups had that ran MIDI, but it's not really. It never really happened. Octamed is fantastic for running MIDI out to synths or samplers. You can run a whole studio off Octamed. It was the equal of anything on the Atari at the time. I'm not going to start an Amiga Atari war, especially not now with the people who are in here. Some amazing trackers on the Atari and software which is still alive in some form or another now, Cubase and stuff like that, which yeah, okay. But 68,000 machines were rock solid for running things from, and what Pro Tracker had going for it was that almost every version was free, and free is nice and cheap. I got my first I got my first version of Pro Tracker because my dad was a teacher and he confiscated a bunch of floppy disks that kids were trading on the playground, and he gave them back to the kids on the condition that they made copies that he could bring home to me. So got lots of dodgy games where I heard all these chiptunes for the first time, and I got a copy of Pro Tracker and a couple of modules and started taking them apart, because the other lovely thing about Pro Tracker modules is that they are their own project file. So it is the module is the song that you listen to. It is also a binary file that contains a big list of samples and then a huge bunch of note data. And the replayer looks at the samples, looks at the note data. The note data says, play this sample at this pitch for this length of time in this order, and it does that. So you can think of it like MIDI, with MIDI where you know what it's going to sound like, which in the 90s was not a given. As you'll know if you've played Doom on fancy sound canvas Roland cards or shitty GM keyboards. There's quite a range of quality. Cool. I did a lot of Modplug Tracker way back before it was open Modplug Tracker. It was seemed great for converting between things, but actually it introduced lots of incompatibilities, which I think have been fixed for a long time since Saga Music's took over development and it became open source and stuff like that. I haven't really used it since, but I'm told it can do crazy awesome stuff. So yeah, let's have a look at so that there was some tunes. There was a chiptune, there was a doskpop tune, there was a drum and bass tune, and you can, yeah, anytime I try something Anytime I fancy trying something new that I might otherwise try in a DAW, I will usually fire up Protrack it and give it a try. I fancied doing some UKG stuff a while ago, and it's a very nice natural sequencer to use on its own merits and for any purpose, not just to make nostalgic stuff. Thank you, Hoffman. DJ Hoffman in the chat is the master of drum and bass, UKG, and garage and dubstep on Protracker, and I will be dropping his name a lot and showing off some of his mods over the next few weeks. Do I put a swing in for UKG stuff? I didn't hear, because I wanted to save space in the effects chain and the effects tracks, which I actually haven't used, but at the time I got those breaks together, or those drum patterns together, and then bounced them down with mod to samp and loaded them in as samples, so they just run kind of off each other in sync. I'll play a few of those separately, but you could do it with a swing. I think it ended up, it's really tricky to get, or I find it really tricky to get a UKG swing that works. So I think the patterns that I used to create those breaks had some really intricate note delay stuff going on that it wouldn't be easy to stick in a full 4-track pattern. Yeah, so that's got a little bit of a swing in it that that I did manually in one pattern and then bounced down to a sample so that I wouldn't have to do it in every pattern. I just loaded the sample in. So it's kind of wasteful in terms of space, but hey, it is 2000 and, well, when I wrote this, 2015 or something, and sometimes you've got to stop caring about that. I will talk at some point about authenticity, because authenticity is a myth in almost every area. It's either somebody trying to inflate the value of something, or somebody trying to gatekeep people out of getting involved with something fun. So that's a whole other thing. Where it's useful, and where it's useful for us, is that it introduces a limitation which can be good for inspiration or getting started. I think I probably prepared most of these samples on the Mac and then converted them, which is a whole subject area in itself. And again, I've got Hoffman to thank for a lot of the way I do that now and the way I would describe that process. He helped me kind of get past some quality barriers that I was having trouble breaking. But hey, we also have, if you look down here, we have the Stereo Master plugged into the printer port, and the Stereo Master is a sampler. It's about, I mean, even when they were being sold, they were about £5 worth of kit being sold for about 30 quid. They sound pretty poor, but hey, there are ways to improve the sound you get out of them. I also have a Technosound Turbo. Stereo Master has a 3.5mm jack. This one has a pair of RCA phonos. They both sound equally bad. I have run them against each other, and neither sounds better than the other. I'm reading some things. Tell me how to professionally use panning in tracker music. I have no idea how to use panning. Well, I hate to break it to you, but with very few exceptions, if you're using trackers professionally, you might not get paid. The exception is renoise, but hey, cool. Panning in Fast Tracker 2 is a big deal, and a lot of panning theory comes from, or is informed by the style that you're working in, but listening to reference material is always good. If you're working with sampled and multi-sampled real instruments, then you think about how they would be in the room and how you would want a listener to hear that. As long as we're in Protracker, everything you hear will be mono, and I will talk at length about why that is. The way the Amiga hard pans left and right is not conducive to most music that people write, and it's not how most of that music should be heard. And I wish people wouldn't upload music where it's hard pan. You put on headphones and you get everything, half the stuff in one ear, half in the other ear. Anyway, there are ways to do panning really nicely in Fast Tracker. Fast Tracker has panning envelopes, which are great. You can run each note has its own panning curve that you can draw in a little graph, or you can set the panning with a separate command, either in the main effects strip or in the volume strip. You can put panning commands in there as well, but we'll get to that. Audiologic, I think the Audiologic one might have been better. I don't know if that's true or not. You might have bought a Technosound from me, yeah. Yeah, mono's where it's at. But that's the only area in which I'll be kind of, yeah, firebrandy, fundamentalist about something. Thank you, Ian. Yes. Authenticity. I love it. Ian Stevenson's just joined. He is a spectacularly good folk musician who did a set on Friday at the Sage in Gateshead, which I unfortunately missed because I was looking after children, with lots of live looping. But hey, a lot of people are doing live looping now. This guy's doing some really amazing live looping, next level stuff, and I was really excited by the fact that his fix to a difficulty with getting his MacBook to display the scene changes that he wanted was to put masking tape on the screen and draw them on. That, yes, yeah, you're in the right mindset for this stream which is sponsored by Gaffer Tape, which is holding up these cameras and almost everything else in my studio, which is a proper studio in theory, but it's been mostly dismantled so that I can run this ancient machinery and do this stream. So hey man, dig it out. Honestly, the prices Amigas are getting right now are crazy. I've got, my stocks are dwindling slightly, but I have enough to last me a few catastrophic breakdowns. I mean, the Amiga's breaking down, not me breaking down. When I have a catastrophic breakdown, I tend to go back to the Amiga, and it makes it better. So yeah, where's my notes are here? Hardware and software limitations. I've covered some of them just in the course of doing this. The hardware limitations you'll have seen if I run a pattern here and mute 3 of the channels. We've got 4 channels here. That's your lot. that's your maximum polyphony at all. If you think you hear more than that, it's either because a composer is doing some awesome magic tricks, which I will cover, and lying to your ear, and your ear is lying to you, and that's great. Or it's because they've bounced down a whole bunch of samples into one, which I've done, which you could theoretically do to infinity with diminishing quality as you went. But I've muted channels 2, 3, and 4, and here we have just one. Second channel's just doing that. Third is... So yeah, you can't get precious about one sound having its own channel all the way through your piece. That's probably not going to happen. So here we've got two different ones bunking up. We've got an orchestral hit there, string hit. We've got what sounds like it might be a high-pitched sampling of the Korg M1's organ 2 patch, which you will know from millions of popular classics. And that is just whoops, 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 whoops. Actually, whoops tend to get their own channel on a track like this, and drums often get their own channel on a track like this. But yeah, 4 channels is your limit on polyphony. Even your scale, at least in Protracker, is limited. You go from C1 to B3 there, which is almost but not quite 3 octaves. No, yeah, almost but not quite 3 octaves. So if you want to go beyond that, then you might have to double up on an instrument, that costs you disk space or RAM, and upsample or downsample one of those, or record it twice at different pitches. That is done quite a lot. Yeah, I mean, stuffing as much as you can into one channel is the thing to do, and I will go through that from scratch either tonight or another night, and there are lots of nice tricks. The tricks you do to get that to work give a character to the sound that is quite distinctive as well. So those things, the stylistic and the practical, are wrapped in to each other. Yeah, it's good to have bass on its own channel occasionally, but equally, when you can run bass and a kick drum in the same channel at the same time, that's pretty cool. It means you're using the right kind of bass and the right kind of kick. Yeah, so interface overview. Right, okay, let's have a look at the interface. I'm gonna change view screen thing just for a minute. And here is, I'll clear that out. Here's what you see when you start Protracker. It's not what everyone sees when they start Protracker. This is version 2.3e, which is a fix for version 2.3d. 2.3d has been around since 94 or 5, I think, and it's the one. It's the best. It's the standard. It's the most compatible. After that, things went a bit crazy, and I'll show you some of those ones. There are 3.15 and 3.61 and 6.2 they have interesting features. They look higher res. They are full of bugs, and you find out usually halfway through a tune that you forgot to save. So yeah, 2.3D is the one, but it had its own bugs, and a programmer called 8-Bit Bubsy has fixed those. He went through, trawled through all the source code, and fixed it. Fixed loads of stuff, added some things, took out some things that didn't work, removed a few limitations that had no real need to be there. They were just there because of reasons. So yeah, I've hacked in my own graphics here because I'm a tedious aesthete. But normally what you see here is the Quadra Scope, which as you saw is a 4-channel oscilloscope, sort of an oscilloscope, or the spectrum analyzer, which isn't really a spectrum analyzer, only in the loosest sense. I should show you this stuff while a tune is running. Let's have a tune that I threw together for this. I put this together this afternoon to see if I could remember how to make chip samples out of using a text editor by typing in ASCII characters and hoping that the value in binary would give you full amplitude and then minimum amplitude. We'll talk about that. That's cool. But yeah, spectrum analyzer looks awesome, but isn't really much help with anything. There's no kind of structured way to introduce you to the interface here because it's kind of just thrown together wherever it lands. Sound Tracker by Karsten Obarski was the first of this style of tracker. And the first thing that we would really recognize as a tracker. There were some internal development tools used by Commodore 64 programmers earlier in the decade, which we might think of as being a bit more like trackers. But we started to see this familiar format that was repeated all over the place in 87 or 88. Somebody will undoubtedly correct me on that. I will get things wrong, and anybody, the people most likely to know what it actually is will almost certainly be in the chat and will tell you. So there you go. And yeah, we've got, so that's what you see when you open it up. If you click this hot corner that says, so that says pause, and that gives you this position editor and stuff. But if you hit the top corner of that button, it asks you if you're sure you want to quit, which is great. There's a lot of a lot of stuff packed in for convenience where you least expect it. We have play and stop. I never use those buttons because I have them on the keyboard. Play just the pattern rather than playing through the whole sequence of tunes. This, I'll use the mouse for pointing, needless to say. My finger's not very helpful. This is where you organize the order of the patterns, and a pattern is a big block, looks like a spreadsheet here, 64 lines up and down, 4 channels across, and in each pattern you have a space for a note to go, which is a musical note on the chromatic scale, and an instrument number, which tells you which sound you want to use. And I'm cycling through those with Control and the arrow keys, which you can't quite see in the camera there. And that's changing this sample number up here. So you can think of it as instrument, and you have some control over how that instrument is played, but not much, not as much as you do in Fast Tracker. Oh yes, Carsten's first one actually had bass, drums, lead and stuff written above the tracks. Yeah, I forgot about that. That was nice. Yeah, so fine tune, volume, that's about as much as you have that is done on the fly. Everything else is something you've done destructively to the waveform. There's a whole lot of, if you nervous about destructive editing, then yeah, you have to take extra care to back up the sample you're working on, maybe duplicate it to a new slot, work on it there, because there's no undo for that. There is now, and I'm not sure if it was, I don't think it was there before. I think 8-Bit Busby has added an undo for the pattern editor, which is pretty handy because it doesn't look like much when you just type in a note and think, okay, well, I'm going to do Control, done something cleared the whole module? Yeah, I have. Wow, that was something. There is a shortcut that I clearly haven't learnt yet that gives you undo when you've made a blunder. But you'd be saving all the time, and we'll get to that. That you should be saving always. Even saving is fraught with danger. And remember, in this incarnation, and in almost every, well, I think every Pro Tracker incarnation and most Noise Tracker incarnations, they were not commercial ventures. They were being done as internal tools for demo groups or as shareware stuff. Maybe sometimes there was a version that somebody hoped would make some money and it never did, I don't think. I think the only real commercial one that shifted any copies as such was Carsten Nabarski's Sound Tracker first version. So typically you have people patching other people's work, you have people adding new features, people deviating from the mod format and adding to that and developing it. So it evolved, but then sometimes it went down cul-de-sacs and dead ends where incompatibilities arose. But what we're looking at is not something that was ever intended to satisfy a board of commercial directors or a customer user group or anything like that. This is just learning the muscle memory, and then hopefully every subsequent version things will be roughly where you expect them to be. Edit, that's just, I mean, there's so much efficiency here, but also there's stuff like, that's a space bar, you don't need a button for that, that's crackers. Maybe somebody else uses that button, tell me if you do, I'm interested to hear. The setup screen, that's a whole trip, we'll come back to that. Doskpop is where you load and save. Again, fraught with danger for the uninitiated. This is a really good way to completely zap your work, so counterintuitively. So, but sampler is where all these samples live. This all runs. I mean, the nice thing about stuff like this, there's no slowdown here because everything is run against a rock solid CPU. There's no fighting for space. There's no kind of multi-threading or anything like that. Anything that works. It's pretty difficult to disrupt the audio that's coming out, and that's kind of cool. I'll record a sample from an external source now. The external source is this Yamaha QY70 workstation, I think they colloquially were known as. That is got lots of underwhelming workstation samples on, but you can ignore all the sequencing stuff and basically just treat it as a sound source. Bump up the volume as much as I can. It's not very loud, unfortunately, and we will sample. So now we're hearing samples. Now we're hearing audio that is being sampled, being monitored, but not yet sampled. So once we click that button, we can then hear the audio that's going through into the stereo master through the printer port into Protracker, banging the hardware. It's all of this is banging the hardware. There's I'm not sure how the parallel port sampler works, but it does, and it's like a couple of components thrown together. Hoffman might know. Let's find a sample. Let's find some synths. Yeah, it's workstation time. These are all quite inoffensive. There's a sort of super saw trumpety thing going on. So typically you'd line up the signal you wanted, monitor its level. I would like to get it hotter than this because that reduces the noise floor a bit. I can't get it hotter than this without amplifying it in between. But it does sound like a doskpop sample pack. It was... Oh man, the sounds in here, some of them are pretty amazing, to be honest. Anyway, so when you're ready, so I press left click to monitor, which kind of grabs the mouse and holds it there, and then again, counterintuitively, right click is the one you want to actually start recording. The screen will glow black with the effort of doing that, and it will run until it runs out of RAM, or you click another mouse button and come out of it. And invariably, you sample more than you want to, which is usually fine. Turn that off and yank it. You probably have a sample of where you are mashing your fingers on the source synth, so you can cut that out. Get yourself just long enough to get a nice loop on it. Zap anything you don't need. If you can get a loop on a smaller bit of sample, then kill the rest of it, because that's just wasting space. That's not the worst loop. Yeah, I've looped worse than that many's a time. And then you've got a whole bunch of stuff here which isn't useful to us just yet. But you typically need to do a bit more to get the sample the way you want it. Almost all of this is kind of, if you're an aficionado of low noise, crystal clear recordings, this is all turd polishing of the highest order. This volume thing is a destructive gain control, as opposed to this, which is just the volume at which the sample is played. And that's an important distinction we'll look at as we go on. And it's really handy that those two things are distinct and work differently, because your default volume can be down here at 10, but then you can override that with a command, which can be very handy, because anything that saves you an effects slot on the screen here is handy, and we'll see why when we come to effects. Samples. Right, so, oh flip. Oh. Amiga's multitasking. Hey, that's why I'm able to run the operating system in the background, tracker here, shells and text editors all over the place. But it also means that sometimes you accidentally hit this key and send the Protracker screen to the back. Where was I? Sampler. Yeah. So, we need to make that louder. We could tap on here one click at a time, or let it run and probably skip over where we want to be. But something that is not universal, but pretty widespread in Protracker, because not all of these conventions are conventions, but one of the stronger ones is that you hold right click and then tap left, and it will increment a value in 10 at a time, which is handy, because 120 is a value that I like to use for boosting samples when I know that it'd be quite easy to just clip them. 120 is manageable. So every time I'm clicking, it's destructively boosting the volume of this sample. And I'm going to run it into the clip just a little bit, because I'm wild. And it's quite slow on this, because this is an Amiga 600, unaccelerated Amiga 600, so it takes a moment to do some of that heavy lifting. yeah, musical assembly programming, being absolutely stingy with disk space, with RAM, with what you could do in a limited space, and that's awesome. That's the big appeal for me. So we've got a sample about as loud as it's wise to go. Now, there's two things going on here: boost and filter, which are interesting. Filter gives you a bit of a low pass, and it will take the edge off something that has come in to the sampler with a lot of noise, or from another source from disk, but usually it's the sampler where you get the bad stuff. And boost gives you a sort of high-end EQ boost that adds, Hoffman will correct me on this because I think he knows the boost inside out, possibly to the code level, but I think it's adding a bunch of very high-end distortion to kind of give that sparkle that nowadays is being sold to people as part of mastering VST suites. That vintage high-end sparkle, and yeah, it's just very selective distortion on some of the upper frequencies that are quite pleasing to the ear. Now, it's not always pleasing to the ear here, but it can really give drums some snap. If you sample drums into here, and you'll typically find that after you recorded them, or you got them from a really nice 16 or 24-bit sample pack at 48K, 44.1K, you bring them over here, or you convert them on Mac or PC. You smash them down at 8-bit and 11025, and you think, shit, man, it's gone. All my happy hi-hats are gone. So you get them in here, you hit boost a few times, and it adds back a load of snap, which in, for instance, a hi-hat sample would only have been distortion anyway. That's most of what you're hearing, very complex noise at the top end of a hi-hat. So that can give you some of that snap back again. And echo is such an unpredictable thing to use. It is kind of a DSP, offline DSP delay function, but I'm never quite sure what I'm going to get out of it. Maybe somebody else is. Thanks, Mick. Maybe somebody else. Again, Hoffman might have had a bit more experience with that, but I'm pretty sure he does what the rest of us do when we need big sumptuous delay, which is to do it on the PC and then port it over. So chord fade up and fade down. Again, that's a destructive thing you can do on here. You can do fades with commands in the pattern, but you might, if you know that sample should fade every single time, like it's an orchestral hit, and you want it to slide out gently, there's no point in wasting a command on that. So here's where you do it. Backwards is handy. Won't make much difference to us here, but it can be handy for things. Upsample and downsample we will look at when we get to optimizing and sound quality concerns, or how to make a sample do something that it won't at first blush. And these are mods, kind of modulating kind of thing. Chord is interesting because, again, so we have the sample editor has 3 windows, 1, 2, and 3, but it actually has 4. But the 4th isn't on this list. The 4th, because that is exit. So none of this stuff ever seemed crazy to me. It's just having to actually explain it to people makes me realize that's not entirely intuitive. So 3 chord is a 4th window where you can. So if you want to mix those two together, which you might want to do, you stick your first note in there, your second note in there, and then you say, yeah, I want to blend those two together. And this took me a while to figure out. You got the letter N up here. Switch, or clicking the N itself doesn't switch the thing. You click this, and it switches between O and N. O is for original. That means we're going to blend these two notes, or two different pitches of playback of this sample. We're going to blend them into the original sample, so you're going to lose the original. N stands for new, which means it'll blend it to the next available new sample. And it'll probably take a wee while, so let's do. And they also have some pre-made samples, major, minor, 7, sus4, stuff like that. And you can choose what length you want it. So if you want to give it more length so that you can do an echo in it, I think that's what that's for, or paste extra stuff behind it. How long this will take on the Amiga 600 resampling. That's pretty good. We're getting some progress information, not a progress bar, but you learn. Oh, was that absolutely brilliant? There we go. Well, that hasn't, I don't know if that hasn't happened before. That specific thing hasn't happened before, but I am hammering the hell out of this Amiga 600. So I'm going to swap in the nearest 1200 that I can reach, which is this one. You've won the prize. Oh, come on, that's what you came for, isn't it? You'd be disappointed if you hadn't had one of those tonight. The latest version of the chord window has been okay for me, actually, but I haven't used it a great deal in 2.3e, I suppose. Swapping out Amigas. Oh yeah. There we go. Well. I'm actually a little surprised it didn't happen before now. So this Amiga has not a 68,000 chip in it, but a 68020 chip, which runs at I think about 14 megahertz, which is about twice the speed of the A600. Canon will correct me if I'm wrong by a few a few fractions of a. Ooh, where's it gone? Oh yeah, definitely waited to learn. And this one also has an accelerator card in, which is a Blizzard 030, which bumps it to 50 megahertz, 50 megahertz. Not the fastest Amiga I've had, but pretty fast, and definitely fast enough for anything you want to do in Protracker. I mean, it starts up a lot quicker already. And it has some other things on as well. It can run AHX, which the other one doesn't run very well. And it has mod to samp, which we'll be looking at, because that goes back to what I was saying about the bouncing drums into one channel, into one big sample. Because one thing you'll find yourself doing a fair bit, unless you're doing just chiptunes, is I'll show you. Oh God, this is, yeah. Hopefully I've got some actual tunes on here. QY time, what's that? I think that's something I made with the. Oops, they're quite hot. This is an 030 rather than an 060. It used to be an 030, well actually the other one over there used to be an 030 with PPC, Cyberstorm, which was awesome but not necessary. I sold that for a small fortune to a weird bloke. Anyway, I got this 030, which is really nice, really compatible with a lot of cool demos, and It's got a lot of extra RAM in it, which Protracker ignores entirely because that RAM is not fast enough. It's not as fast as chipmem. So yeah, we've got a tune there. Hopefully that's not too loud. And because we're multitasking, we can nip back to Workbench and we can open mod to samp, and we can load the tune that we're in now, that we're working on. And we can say, did it load? Oh, maybe it's only one channel. So we can say, okay, well, I want the first 16 lines of the first pattern, and then I wanted it pitch C3, volume 50, just in case we get any clipping, mixing. Shouldn't take, yeah, that was just a few seconds. It would take taking a lot longer than the A600, about 60 seconds. And play it. So that's the sample we've got, which we could go back to Protracker and load in. This is not an ideal example. Normally you would do this with some drums or something. Oh, I forgot to save it anyway. You would save it somewhere and load it back in. Yeah, it was quite Daft Punk, yeah. Let's hear it again. That's all they do. I mean, they do it really well, so can't knock it. And just offset that loop a bit every 5 minutes, and you've got a hit of the summer. Yeah, so I mean, we could make a tune, couldn't we? That's the thing we could do. Yeah, let's do that. How are we doing for time? It's 10 past 10. People sick of this yet? Good man, Hoffman. The best way to use chord is probably not to use chord. The Windows and Mac version of Protracker 2.3D, which 8-bit Bubsy also developed using SDL. There are some things he had to take out because they didn't make any sense on a modern system, but he replaced them with handy things like he built in mod to samp, which is really handy because it's just right there. I think it's where setup is here, and that's useful. Oh, flip. Excuse me a second. Right, so we can clear all, and we're starting with nothing, and let's assume all we've got is an Amiga and Protracker. We've got no samples, we've got no, no sampler, no synths or anything like that. So what we could do is jump back to Workbench, open the command line, fire up an editor, just in RAM, and .smp means nothing. File extensions generally mean little or nothing on the Amiga, but it's a good way of visually knowing what a thing is. In fact, when file extensions do mean something on the Amiga, they tend to be prefixes rather than suffixes. Mod dot name of your tune, and so a lot of mine, because I tend to work cross-platform, are usually mod dot Syphus blah 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 dot mod, which gets a bit unwieldy on the Amiga. So we've got a blank text file here, and I'm just going to stick in some ASCII characters, but particular ASCII characters. So I think in the character set, capital C with a cedilla is 127 or 128, and you get that with Shift Alt and C. And let's say we want this to be about 32 samples long. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And what's the other? Should we do a 0 or a space? I can't remember what gets us the most amplitude. Let's try that, and just for the crack, let's put 8 spaces in. Save that. It should be saved under RAM, and then flip back to the Amiga, and in doskpop we want to load a sample from RAM disk. There we go. That was more straightforward than it usually is. Oh, did it load it as a module again? Jesus, that's been happening to me for, let's say, 22 years, and I'm still not getting it right. Yeah, so I want to load a sample, and I want to do it from the RAM disk. There we go. So it doesn't care what that data is. It hopes that you've formatted it into something it can understand. The right endianness and all the rest. But some versions can take different formats as well, like ASV and stuff, but I don't think this one is configured for that. And yeah, so that's what it sounds like. Go. We'll loop that. And we've got a square wave, a sort of wonky square wave. Let's tighten it in a bit. So this is essentially working as an oscillator would in a synth. An oscillator produces signal according to a waveform that is set by the user or the design of the synth. A square wave, a sine wave, something like that. You blend those together, you get the kind of sounds that synthesizers make. We're doing much the same thing. We're looping or oscillating some signal round and round really fast. The signal is just in that waveform. We have some ability to tune it. It's called fine tune. It's not that fine. It's finer on Fast Tracker 2 with much higher resolution, but we've got about, what was that? 4 bytes. My quick math isn't so quick. So yeah, now that we've got that, we can start making a tune with it. We can start putting in notes. We should decide what speed we want this whole thing to run at using the F command. But there are 2 F commands. F commands above, is it 20? I think above 20 do BPM, and F commands below that do pattern speed. They're 2 different things. Doesn't matter for now why they're different, but a tempo we can see up there, 134. I want it slower. I want 128, 70 should give me 125. Yeah, the speed of 3. So if I change the speed, the BPM will be the same, kind of, but the rate at which the lines are processed and the ticks between the tick resolution changes according to the speed that you run this at. So that doesn't matter too much in a lot of styles, but in chip music, well, anyway, I'm digressing again. Let's do a tune. And some notes, and usually if I put a few notes into a tracker when I'm doing a chiptune, the first thing I want to do is get some pad and delay in. There are no effects here, there's no DSP. If you want delay, you have to do what delay does. And what delay does is make a note happen a little bit later and quieter than the original note. So one way of doing it, you might think, well, first let's give some, I'm gonna I'm doing a lot of things that I will come back to in more detail, so I just changed the note step or the note skip, or edit step. It's called edit skip here. That means when I press a key, that value is how many lines it will jump by. So if I want to type in a lot of things fast, like I'll set that to 2. I want to type in a load of A's like that, with gaps in the middle, it'll let me do that, and a load more here. A is a fast volume slide because I want each of these to sound a bit more plinky. If I bring that up to F, actually, I can get it even more. But A, I usually prefer for a chiptune. So yeah, if I was lazy and blessed with more spare tracks than I needed, then I would jump to the next track and say, okay, well, I can copy all of that, which I just did by marking the block. Control B, and marked it to the end. And now I've got it in the buffer, and I can paste it like that. So that's delay, kind of. Technically it is, that's what delay is doing. If you run at a higher BPM, at a higher speed and a lower BPM, then you can give yourself more resolution. In other words, more rows of notes pass in the same length of time, and if you can do that, then you could get stuff in time between these lines here. But we don't need that right now. There's multi-tap delay, 2 taps. But that's... And then, of course, we want to make these a bit quieter, so we'd use a volume command, C, replace all of these, replace all of these, and do C1. So you don't have to think in hex, but it helps if you think about some of these things in hex. So 0 to 63 is the range of a lot of these commands, but we're in hex to save space because it saves space. That's the nice thing about hex if you're a tracker musician. It means that if you need to put 127 in a field, then you can just type FF and you've saved yourself a character in space in the most practical sense. So C, volume resolution for a sample goes from 0 to 63, but in hex that's 0 to 40, well 64, but that's 1 to 40, and so 10 is a quarter of that, 20 half, and it's quite easy to think in those terms. And if you want to get somewhere between 10 and 20, then you have to think in hex for the second character that you're going to use, but we're not going to do that now. So that sounds a bit dreamier. That sounds a lot more nice JRPG, but that seems awfully wasteful. I mean, let's bring it up a bit. Yeah, it's a bit more DuckTales. Look, we're using this entire channel for just a delayed offset, lower volume duplicate of this one. That's crazy. Let's do paste merge now. I never get this right. I normally put these in by hand. I normally do what I'm about to do here by hand. Is it something like... Yes, I think it is. I think it's Control J, and I always get it wrong. So now we've squished the... it doesn't sound the same. It's got quite a different character. If we wanted that dreamy JRPG Nezzy sound, then we would probably just ease back on other instruments and take the 2 channels. And I've got some examples of that being done. But here we want to pack these channels with other stuff. We want basses, we want arpeggios, we want maybe a second lead. So we can step through the lines one by one with enter. So you can hear that after every principal note at full volume, we get the previous note echoed at a lower volume in the gap between that principal note and the second and the subsequent principal note. Like I say, I normally do those by hand, which is quite therapeutic, if a bit fiddly. But I mean, it also means that sometimes you use your editorial judgment a bit, and you think, well, if the timing was quite loose or maybe syncopated in the preceding few notes, then you might want to change which note gets the delay. You can change your delay by putting a different note in that delayed slot, and that pattern delayed slot, which sometimes is quite nice. Sometimes you need to do it because the delayed note is clashing with another note with the same instrument on a different channel, which can give you a sudden blurt of volume on that note on that line, which sometimes sounds awesome, sometimes you don't want. That pattern merge function, I can't tell because of the way 8-Bit Bubsy has updated the documentation. I can't tell if it was always in there and I never realized, or I just never got that far through the help guide. But I think it's probably new. I'm sure I would have discovered it by now. So yeah, the has it always been there? Does anybody know? Because, yeah, as we discovered earlier, I can't even trust myself to remember the undo combination because I just learnt never to rely on it. So I'm not sure how. I'm assuming, and it's not safe to assume with Protracker, but I'm assuming that when you do a merge paste, it will drop the new notes into any available gap, but not overwrite an existing note. But that's a very dangerous assumption. But yes, it is therapeutic to do it by hand. And when you really love this sound, not that sound, that's not helpful, this sound of tappy tappy keys on a Sunday night in a warm room, it's it's good. And it just gives you control, and there's a whole load of stuff you can automate in this whole thing. I mean, it just you wouldn't feel like you'd crafted something, which is fine. Not everybody wants to. Hey, you don't have to protrack, which might be a good motto for this. Nobody should be made to protrack, but if you want to, then let's do it. Oh god. Yeah, I mean, actually I've got the monstrous PPC Amiga that now doesn't have a PPC in it. This one also has a knackered keyboard. I think I have a membrane lying around that will replace it. If the membrane itself isn't ruined. But yeah, that's pretty manky. I think I thought that was a good idea at the time. It was when I was playing live and I wanted to be able to see where my black keys were on the keyboard in the dark. It didn't help. Yeah, I said we'd write a tune, and this isn't not sounding like a tune yet. So normally you want to get a few more notes in the go. We've got one instrument so far. We'll range all. That's a selection range. We'll range all. We'll do a copy. It's in the buffer, and we'll move the position head at the beginning with beg, and do a paste, which will put it there, and loop it again. Now this is a big gotcha. Your volume here is always 0 on a new sample that hasn't had anything in it. So when you wonder why the hell it's not making any sound, that's probably why. Bring that up to 40 up here. Set the loop points to the same place. That's slightly different because we've got the loop points in a different place, but it's okay because we're going to do different things. This is just going to be a lower volume copy of the same thing. So at the tiny cost of a few bytes of an extra sample, we're going to have a quieter one, even quieter than that, I think. That'll come in handy in all sorts of places, but right now we can go through this and change all of these instrument 1 commands on that echo to 2 for the echoed ones, and then zap all of these now redundant volume controls. Blah, 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 blah. And now we can give the same A commands to the echoed notes, which is nice because it keeps them consistent with the notes that they're echoing, which might become more apparent at some parts of some tunes, so it's handy to be able to do that. The volume slide is a bit less elegant on those notes because they're already near the lower volume that this A command sends them to, which is a volume slide command. So I would say, well, let's take that back to 8 for those ones on instrument 2. That sounds a bit more reasonable. I mean, I don't like this melody, but we've got it now and we'll stick with it for the moment. So the next thing we're going to do is get a bit of variation on this sample, which, if you remember, is sitting in RAM as a text document. So we're going to gradually replace some of these bytes, essentially ASCII bytes, with more capital C cedillas. So take 4 out, put 4 in, save as, back to the Amiga, and a fresh sample here, and load that thing again. Get the same loop on the go. That didn't do what I expected, so I've changed something that I shouldn't have done. Maybe, did I put enough? No. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 20. Pretty sure I put back as many as I took out, but I'll add a couple of zeros in the end and see if that makes any difference. I don't think 0 is the one to use, by the way. I think it's probably space would do the trick, or there might be a weird full stop character that's not quite like a normal full stop. Close enough. I've shifted the duty cycle a bit by, I mean, essentially I'm drawing the shape in ASCII characters, so you just have to imagine that if cedilla C is your high point on that waveform, what the hell have I done? There we go. Right. So I've just shifted that duty cycle over a bit, and now we have a bit of variety. I'll go to the next one. I'll go back to the editor again, and we didn't save it properly. That's it. With some more cedillas, and I don't think I should be adding more zeros in the end, but it worked last time. Let's load this one in here, full volume, loop it. Now I think I need to go a bit more drastic on here. That doesn't feel right, but I'll do it anyway. I'm adding zeros to the end every time. Anyway, that's enough variation. Because what we want is a sort of, I'm going to mute that for now, and we're going to try this in a new channel. What I want is, right, you'll recognize that, I'm sure. I messed the end up a bit, but hey, it's a tribute rather than a recreation. So now I can go through and change some of these instrument numbers. I've still got my edit skip on 2, and my extra instruments, the new ones I've just created and added are, so I've got 1, 3, 4, 5. That's enough for a bit of variety. Let's start with 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 1, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 1, 3. Yeah. So now we've got what sounds like pulse width modulation, but it's not. It's just changing the samples because the samples have slightly different pulse widths, and we're treating them as if they're oscillators. And now with this amazing merge function, I'm going to take all the fun. This would normally be the high point for my sad little evening, would be tapping all these delays in manually, but I'm going to do it this way. So you don't really want to have to duplicate like 3, 4, 5, 8 samples if you can help it for a chiptune, because the spirit of the thing is to keep it small. So the sacrifice you make there is you have to use your effects for volume on your delays, but that's okay because they wouldn't be doing much else right now. And if we were going to have vibrato and stuff, we'd just add it on the original and leave it off the delayed note. Let's do some dirty cheating. It's not really cheating because there's no such thing in composing music. It really isn't. And we'll add it. I needn't have shifted it down. Anyway, we'll add it here, see what happens, and then we'll kill this, and we've muted that. So let's have a listen. No, that's not happening. But yeah, that's how you would do that, and that's one of the various backbones of a certain type of chiptune. Definitely a type that I would write a lot of the time. I would have an ARP like that going on somewhere in the background, or that. I mean, that's more of a hook that we all know and love, but I would use that technique to create an ARP that looped around while other stuff was going on. And sometimes I would double up by having an arpeggiator command, which is an entirely different thing, but something that even if you're not that familiar with chiptunes, you might recognize as being a pretty central stylistic feature of chiptunes. So let's get one of those in. I can't put it in there because I'm going to move this BPM command over here out of our way because I want to use this channel for some ARPs, and I'm going to mute. I've muted everything else. Let's go into G minor now, or something approximating G minor. I'm not sure what this actually is because I've got good relative pitch but not perfect pitch, and I'm sure whatever random number of characters I typed into a text editor wasn't spot on 440 hertz. Yeah, there's a note, and 0 is an effect as well, and it is arpeggiator, or arpeggio, which is technically an arpeggio. It's an effect that was introduced originally to, I mean, probably this effect appeared in C64 over 20 days. It might even have appeared in the Atari 2600. Somebody might be able to correct me there. But it's considered a very poor substitute for actual polyphony and actual chords, where you would instead roll 2 or 3 notes round and round really, really fast and hope that people's ears would be deceived into believing they're hearing chords. Now, you might laugh, but it does. It works. It definitely lays down a solid sense of the key, the chord progression, and the harmony in a chiptune, and as well as having a really beloved distinctive flavor of its own. So it's pretty simple if you're acquainted with semitones, or half steps, as I think they would call them in some countries. So we call a full tone a note, and a half tone or a semitone as a half note or a half step, or they all mean the same thing. And you count those again in hex, and 0 is the command itself, the arpeggiator command, so you don't touch that. Then you've got 2 slots, because as well as this note, which is your bass note, you have 2 other notes that you can add to this 3-note chord, this triad. So we've got G, and we are going to go. So with 4, we get 4 it's not a 4th interval, that's 4 semitones. So we get B flat, is it? Oh, sorry, 0 is an interval, of course, and is ignored because when it's 0, 0, 0, it assumes no effect. But 3 is the minor interval that I wanted there. So that's a pretty straightforward minor triad, and it becomes more audible if we add a bit of length to it. There we go, there's a chiptune up. Another thing that made me fall in love with these daft looping 20-second tunes at the start of crack-tros and pirated games. Lots of awesome tunes are just done with almost no effects and just one of those looping around in the background, and it does your head in after a while, in a good way. And that's when people know if they can deal with listening to this stuff or not. Looping a few of those. But hey, we've got a lower volume duplicate of that sample. It doesn't require us to waste a volume command on instrument 2, so we can keep the effect in place. Now suddenly we've got what sounds like a rudimentary ADSR envelope. It sounds like we've got a release and a decay and a sustain. And that's handy because too much up can really hide some of your other stuff. Yep, that's what that sound is. Yeah, it's just an attempt to trick people into thinking that one note of polyphony was 2 or 3. And on other trackers, if you can run 6 or 7, 8, however many notes you want in an ARP, and we'll look at AHX tracker, which lets you do that. Now, you might have to run the whole thing a bit more slowly so you can hear all those notes if you want to do that, but you can do some really nice things with that. SID trackers, C64 trackers do that a lot. Composers do that a lot. So when you change your note here, let's get that edit skip off for now. Now it's a bit tricky to write these because when you do the note preview, which is on enter, and actually you can do note preview backwards on backspace, which file that away for later. It doesn't play the effect. Sadly, it doesn't preview the effect, so you have to kind of get into the habit of punching in these numbers, having worked them out in your head, or having varied them a certain degree from the previous number, and then run the whole pattern to see how it sounds. So now I want a major triad, so all I need to do there is to take that 3 semitone interval up to 4 semitones. Like that. And I'll do the same thing. Oh, hold on. Just a minute. Just a minute. My wife's just finished work at 20 to 11 on Sunday. That was a bit weird. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that's how you do that, and I think it's getting on for an hour and 3/4. I should wrap it up, not least because my MacBook is going to melt. Sorry, not paying enough attention to the chat. It's the first time I've done this, but yeah, cool. So I think I'm going to call it there. I'll zap this, I think, and we'll start a fresh one and do a dedicated session for that. If anybody catches this, once Twitch turn it into a video that you can watch in your own time, then you might see things that you think, oh, I'd like a session on that thing specifically, because I've jumped around a lot. There's a lot of jumping around, and there's a lot of stuff where I said, we'll talk about that, and we will talk about that. And here's another quick blast of actually, that's something I do in every tracker for the first time, just to see how the tracker feels, and now it's usually that melody. And I usually try and sing along and fail, because we have very different vocal registers, as you may have gathered. Okay, thank you all very much for watching. Yeah, let me know what you thought. Let me know what you'd like to hear about. If I think it's within the very broad spectrum of stuff I've said I'd like to cover, then that's cool. Otherwise, I'll look at it and see if I think we can make a whole stream out of it. If you think it's too long, let me know. If you think it's the sound quality's too bad even for an Amiga stream, then let me know. Hopefully it's not the worst you've heard. This is a very nice lav mic that I normally use on actors at work, but it might be very accurately picking up all the fan noise as well. So you tell me what you think, but also bear in mind there's a level beyond the Amiga, beyond which the Amiga is not going to sound that much better at all. This is the A1200 is a bit less noisy than the Amiga 600. The Amiga 600 kicks out noise when you move a window around, that kind of thing. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on there. Just the typing. Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing might be better if I lounge way back from it. When I do a session on emulated or ported versions of Protracker, I'll be using the much maligned Bluetooth Apple keyboard, which is very quiet, and you won't hear that. But oh, it's no problem. Okay, cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for watching. If this encourages one person to give Protracker a go, then I'll be happy. Did I remove? No, I haven't done that. Although Dopefish recapped that one. No, he must have recapped a different one for me. I think he recapped a different A600. That one probably hasn't been touched. In fact, I've had good luck with capacitors. Yeah. Yeah, I should do that. I've played live off that thing so many times. Actually, it was a blessing for some of those live shows. A lot of my stuff's quite high-pitched, and at Blip Festival in New York, I think it would have made New York's dogs throng to the building if I'd run it without that weird filter. But yeah, okay, right. I'm gonna knock this on the head. Thank you very much, and good night. And I'm gonna, yeah, we'll talk about this more quiet, not as quiet. Hey, either's a nice change. Either makes a nice change. Okay, thank you all. That's it. Good night.